Since we have some visitors, I'm going to do a little bit of rehearsing of where we've been in our study of eschatology. The goal has been to take a look at where we end up. And where we end up has to do with what are God's purposes in history. The Bible is very clear that His kingdom is paramount in His mind. The fact that He has prepared a kingdom for His Son, He has seated His Son on the throne, and His Son, Jesus Christ, reigns now. We really beat up the idea of the kingdom, spending weeks and weeks and weeks on going through verses, verse after verse in the Bible that talks about that kingdom of Christ as being God's major purpose in the Bible. So if that's His purpose, well then that's where we're headed. That's the end. What eschatology is all about is the doctrine of end things. So we know that we're headed for the kingdom. We talked about the church and Israel. Is Israel the church? And we went through verse after verse showing that the promises given to Israel have been the same promises given to the church, and the same promises have been applied to the church over and over in the New Testament. So we've been through the kingdom, we've talked about Israel, we've talked about the great revival that's going to happen in the last days. In these last days, the last days as Peter's identified them, that we're living in now, the last days being post-resurrection, post-ascension. And we have that great revival of the inbringing of the Jews that's promised in Romans chapter 11. And we have that to look forward to, and how the Puritans prayed for the Jews as to be brought into the kingdom and be full brothers, that we are Israelites because the church is Israel, but the national Israel, the ethnic Israel, is going to be brought to believing faith at some point in a mass conversion. That's what's promised in chapter 11 there of Romans. And now we're talking about the millennial issues. Now, of course, we went through last week, we just talked about the amillennial, postmillennial views. We've talked about how the amillennial view is very similar to the postmillennial view, except that they see Christ's kingdom as more spiritual. They spiritualize everything, so that the kingdom, yes, Christ reigns, but He reigns in our hearts. And but they're still looking for very bad things, a worsening of culture until Christ returns. They're looking for an apocalyptic end to time in history, at which time that cataclysm will bring in the fullness of the kingdom. Whereas the postmillennial view shows and we talked about the amillennial view. There's a Catholic view, it was Augustine's view, Luther and Langton. Most of the reformers held the amillennial view, and then the postmillennial view, we see the King is Christ now. Full disclosure, Joel and I are both postmillennial, hold the postmillennial viewpoint. We hold that Christ is King now, and the gospel will ultimately be successful. And through the church's efforts, the world will get better. The culture will be affected. That we are to engage the culture, and we are to try to affect the culture in a much better way. And we see promises in the Bible about how the church will be successful in this, and that ultimately the societal structures will continue to get better and better, and that Christ will return as the vast majority of the world is Christianized. We had most of the Puritans held the postmillennial view. Charles Hodge, A.A. Hodge, and B.B. Warfield from Princeton Theological, before it went apostate, held that view. And then in more modern, we have Lorraine Bettner, Rushdoony, North, Chilton, Gentry, Bonson, Francis Nigel Lee. These all held a post-millennial view. What we're going to do to try to get through today is to talk a bit about the historical premillennial and the dispensational premillennial views of what constitutes millennium, and then if we have any time, we'll start to get into some of the some discussion about how the postmillennialists use the millennium in general. We'll go through. I'm going to use Schulten's book, Days of Vengeance, as my talking points on that. So the historical premillennial view holds these 4, 5, 6 points. First, that Christ returns at the end of a tribulation before the beginning of a millennial kingdom. That we've all heard and read about tribulations. It is we have tribulation in this life. We have tribulation that's promised. But they don't see the tribulation as we've talked about in our preterist view, that the tribulation was described as being the tribulation of Israel for AD 70. That when the Romans overthrew Jerusalem in AD 70, that was the Great Tribulation. When we went through the Olivet Discourse, Matthew 24, we see how all of those things took place already. They took place when Israel and Jerusalem were overthrown in AD 70. The historical premillennial view also holds that the millennial kingdom is literally 1,000 years. It's an earthly and physical reign of Christ as king, with the church being the focal point of his reign. That's again, taking that literal 1,000 years that the postmillennialists, amillennialists did not take as literal. The Jews will be converted nationally and restored to their land and occupy a special place in national sense, but spiritually will be part of the church. As this is the historical premillennial view, not the dispensational premillennial view. So there's a viewpoint here that the Jews will be restored to Palestine, and the promises given to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob are going to be in the bounds that were laid out in the Old Testament, that those things are going to be restored. The historical premillennialist believes that the two resurrections of Revelation 20, there's the first resurrection, the second resurrection, that they're going to be separated by that 1,000-year kingdom, that there's a resurrection of the righteous, and then only at the end of the 1,000 years are the unrighteous resurrected for eternal torment. And then at the end of the 1,000 years, Satan will be released from bondage, lead a rebellion of those who were born during the kingdom, but are yet unsaved. Christ will destroy the rebellion, and after the judgments, the church will enter the eternal state of heaven. So those things are the outlines of historical premillennialism. These were held. This was the reason it's called historical premillennialism, is because this viewpoint it sprang up fairly early. You had Irenaeus, Justin Martyr, and Tertullian all held this view. Spurgeon was a historical premillennialist, as were George Eldon Ladd and D.A. Carson more recently. D.A. Carson is a guy that I've learned an awful lot from. He's a terrific teacher. I don't know if you've ever listened to him or read his works. They're very insightful, but he grew up as an amillennial and has come in his later years to hold the historical premillennial view. Now, if there's any discussion, any questions, comments, complaints, please, we want to have some interaction here. Sid, you're smiling.
No, you just mentioned complaints.
Okay.
Do people who hold that view believe that the demons are released right now? Are we in that 1,000-year where Satan releases demons, or?
Satan will be bound during the 1,000 years of the millennial period. But we're not in that yet. Christ returns to begin the millennium. That's why it's pre-millennial. And at that time, when Christ returns, then Satan is bound. and the demons. The extent of his binding, I think, is fairly comprehensive during the millennial period, so that all of the historical premillennials and the dispensational premillennials both read Isaiah 65, 66 as describing the millennial period during which Satan is bound. And all of those blessings, the lion lying down with the lamb, the oxen buried, both eating straw, that kind of stuff, that's happening because Satan's bound. We actually have a physical change in our world. To have the lion eating straw, to have the bear eating hay, being a vegetarian. Now bears will eat anything, they're omnivores. But the lion's a carnivore. That's going to have to change. Now there are, in the post-millennial view, the people who are the eschatological universalists who believe that as things get better and better and better, that everybody's going to get saved by the end, believe that as the blessings flow, as the church is more and more triumphant in time and society and history, that there are actual those same physical changes are going to take place over time. But that we have many, many years for those things to take place. Whereas in the premillennial viewpoints, these things happen in an instant at the return of Christ. So I'm not sure that I am not a eschatological universalist. I'm sympathetic to their viewpoints, but I think they have some problems getting past the wheat and tares and the salt marshes and Ezekiel and those kinds of passages that would point towards there still being unsaved people in time when Christ returns. So that's maybe a long answer to the short question.
Yeah.
Did that answer?
Yeah, yep.
Okay. So did you want to complain? Yeah?
Not yet.
All right. Yeah, they'll get back to me. We have all afternoon. The dispensational premillennial view, which is, I think I would have to say, is predominant in American Christianity today. In American evangelical Christianity is the dispensational premillennial view is this. And I hope I've captured this properly. I've been there, been in most of these viewpoints. First is that the rapture of the church will happen before Daniel's 70th week. It's commonly known as the tribulation period that we just talked about. That the church will be raptured out of this world just before the tribulation. Some people have it before the tribulation, some dispensationalists hold it mid-tribulation, and some right after the tribulation. But in any case, before the 1,000-year reign. That Christ returns at the end of the tribulation, at the beginning of the millennial kingdom. That the millennial kingdom is 1,000 years. It's an earthly and physical reign of Christ over the world, with Israel in the leading position. This entails the rebuilding of the temple, Christ ruling from the throne, literally in Jerusalem, and that the kingdom is the fulfillment of the Old Testament promises to Israel. Further, the two resurrections of Revelation are separated by the 1,000-year kingdom. And that at the end of the 1,000 years, Satan is released the rebellion. That Christ will destroy the rebellion after the judgments of Israel and the church. We'll enter the eternal state of heaven. Is there another? The dispensational premillennial view also holds that there is a different, that God has a different plan for Israel and the church. The church and Israel are separate. That God's promises to Israel have been suspended during the church parenthesis. The church is a period of time called a parenthesis, during which God is dealing with his church and his saved people differently than he will deal with Israel after the church is removed from this world. That the literal promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob will be fulfilled, but after the church is removed. This is the fullness of the Gentiles. The Gentiles, being the church mostly, are raptured out. And then then there's a 1,000-year reign with Christ at the head of the Israelites, who are now ruling the world. That the Jews are going to be in charge of the world, and that the nations will flow to Israel and to look to Israel for guidance and leadership. The most virulent strains of Judaism, Orthodox Judaism, reflect some of this. You'll see in some of their writings strident anti-Gentile writings, strident anti-Gentile feelings that the Goyim, the Gentiles, were created just for the Jews to rule. And there's some very, very nasty things there. There's some very nasty things in the Jewish writings about Jesus. Tim?
What's the main difference between the historical and the dispensational premillennial?
It's just this. It's this idea, it's especially this.
Around Israel?
Yep, and I think the rapture as well. There's the idea that most dispensational premillennial teaching in the U.S. now is that it's a pre-tribulational rapture. That is, the church is taken out, and we aren't going to have to suffer through all of the tribulation. Most of the historical premillennial would say, no, we'll take our beatings. We're going to take our beating. But Christ will return after that tribulation to usher in a 1,000-year literal reign. But that the church and Israel are the church. That Israel is going to be ingathered. They take that ingathering that we talked about in Romans 11, bring that in together to the church. And now Christ is going to rule here physically for 1,000 years of peace and prosperity with the Jews and the church together. The dispensationalists, there's a different plan. The idea of dispensation, the word dispensation is used in the Bible as being, it's a different period of time. It's during this dispensation. But the dispensationalists hold that the covenants, as we've studied before, that those covenants were instituted and that one fails and another is instituted because, let's say, the covenant of works, as it was called for Adam and Eve, failed. They had work to do. Their work was, don't eat from the tree. Failed, okay, boom, that one's over. Now we have our covenant with Abraham. And that one failed. Or, well, we had Noah, and then that one failed, and then Abraham, and then Moses, David, and then we're in the church age. But each age, God's dealing different. In each dispensation, each age, God deals differently with his people. And that's what the Bible teaches. We don't hold that. We see the Bible as covenantal, that it's a covenant, but it's a single covenant that's been refined and added to, clarified, more to the point, not added to so much as clarified as we go.
So the Left Behind series would have been dispensational premillennial.
Yes.
With a little historical strength.
With a little bit, yeah. Right. The Left Behind series is it sells a lot of books, and there are lots of people selling prophecy charts today. Still, it's as Joel and I often talk about, we not to disparage it too much, but it's where the money is. It is in a lot of that teaching, and so I find I came to understand my sin under dispensational teaching. Because indeed, the dispensational teachers still preach a gospel of repentance, that you need to repent and turn from your ways and have faith. I grew up in a UCC church, and I was never challenged with any of that. Everything was fine. Everything was fine because I'd been baptized. And so, you're good to go. Be warmed and well fed kind of thing. Essentially, the preaching was bland, and there was nothing for me to worry about. So when I was 18, I just turned from it and lived like a pagan until I was 40, because I was good. I was baptized. At least dispensational preachers challenged me on that and turned me around. And that's what we'll point out here, is that some of those, the dispensationalism really only started in the 1830s with Darby. It was institutionalized by Scofield in his Scofield Reference Bible. Louis Sperry Schaefer was a student of Scofield, started Dallas Theological Seminary, where Ryrie, Pentecost, Wolford, those guys teach and have written from. I carry a Ryrie study Bible. I've got a lot of stuff scratched out from the study notes, but it was nice big print, big margins. But I came to Christ under dispensational teaching. And then MacArthur, John MacArthur, David Jeremiah, Chuck Swindoll, those are the guys that we know on the radio. We know, we probably name a dozen that are adherents of dispensational theology today. It has, of course, because of the constant date setting, it has suffered some black eyes in the past few years because of with Israel being reformed as a nation, as a political nation in 1948, 40 years as a generation would have called forth the return of Christ by their prophetic scheme. And of course, 1988 came and went, and here we are almost 30 years after that. And so we're almost 2 generations from when this was all supposed to happen. So it's taken its hits, but it's still the most prevalent dominant teaching. I think a lot has to do, and this will sound a little bit controversial, but the idea of getting raptured out before the tribulation has a lot to do with popularity of dispensational thought. How can I escape the tribulation to come? And it's a very appealing thing. To be fair, the dispensational system as a whole is pretty neat. It's got an answer for just about everything. I'm indebted to D.A. Carson, who's a historical premillennialist, for teaching that if you read things through the glasses of the dispensational teaching, if you take their teaching as a whole, then it all makes sense. But he said you have to read through their glasses. The thing is, when you read the Bible, it doesn't necessarily have to be read that way. As for instance, when we went through the Olivet Discourse, they read those things as future, but they don't have to be read as future. We've been taught that, and we've got that presupposition in our minds when we read, and we read all of this futurist viewpoint into it because we've all heard that on the radio preaching and how we've been through it. But we don't necessarily have to read the Bible in just that way. So I'm indebted to, yeah.
No, I'm sorry. Just the tribulation, or the Great Tribulation, how's that fit into the post-millennial view of that?
Our viewpoint on
I
the,
can't hear the question.
I'm sorry, the question was, how does the Great Tribulation fit into the post-millennial viewpoint? When we went over the Olivet Discourse, we talked about how the tribulation, that great tribulation, is greater than it ever has been or ever will be. What happened in AD 70 to Jerusalem was horrific. I mean, there were some unbelievable things that happened with the different factions within Judaism itself that had withdrawn into the fortified city of Jerusalem, with essentially three factions. Two of them revolutionary in their efforts, but opposed to one another, and still opposed to Rome. And they were fighting each other in Jerusalem and preying upon the people who didn't want any parts of either faction. And so they would sally forth. The one group, led by a guy named prophet named John, had taken the temple, and the other group was outside and in the north part of Jerusalem. And they would sally forth from their strongholds to fight one another. And while they were going through the rest of Jerusalem, they would indiscriminately kill, pillage the people who didn't want parts of either. Meanwhile, they're surrounded by Rome, by the Roman army, who had a siege on the city. At the beginning of the siege, Jerusalem had enough stores in grain. Hezekiah had built the tunnel for the water underground, so that they never had any water problems. But they had enough grain to hold out for years, comfortably. But the one faction decided, well, this other faction is going to get a hold of it, so we're going to burn it. So they burned it. So now you have the entire city starving. You have everybody's breaking into everyone else's house for any food. I mean, they would rush into a house, grab people by the throat before they could swallow, and pull food out of their mouths. That kind of thing was going on. It was unbelievable. There were parents eating their children. There's a horrific story about a woman who boiled her own son, and when the people rushed in, they smelled the food being cooked. She had the son on her table, and they were walking to it, and they actually recoiled in horror from that. But those kinds of things were going on. That's a great tribulation, and such as never has been or will be, is certainly talking about at that time. There won't be anything like that again, and certainly in Jerusalem. So that's where the Great Tribulation fits in. We see that as having happened during that 3.5-year siege of Jerusalem. We have tribulation in this life, but we also have God, and we have the Holy Spirit, and we get through those things in a different way than what happened there. So that's how we see that. Have just a few minutes here. The millennial view stems from Revelation 20. This is all about Revelation 20. There's no place else in the Bible that talks about 1,000-year reign. So all these millennial systems stem from Revelation. The question ends up being, in terms of millennium, is about Christ's kingdom. When did Christ's kingdom begin? When did it begin, or when will it begin? That's what the millennial views are dealing with. Is Christ yet coronated and seated at his Father's right hand, or is it a future event? So the amillennial view, the postmillennial views say, yes, Christ rules today. Christ is ruling. The premillennial views will admit to yes, but not quite. And that's where we really start to differ. We feel, as postmillennialists, that Christ rules today, here, now. That he's seated on his throne, and he will be there until all his enemies are made his footstool. And that there's not a return or a cataclysm to take place about that. Orthodox Christianity, now these are points right out of Chilton's book. Orthodox Christianity has always agreed that Christ's reign began at his resurrection and ascension, and will continue until all things are subjected to his feet. We know that from Peter's sermon, we know that even from Daniel, where we had a vision of Christ's coronation in chapter 7. In that sense, though, Christianity has always been post-millennial. And yet, the historic church has always rejected both forms of what was called chiliasm, or thousand-yearism. Thousand-yearism being all this millennial stuff. Premillennialism espouses the second coming as the cataclysm that ushers in the kingdom. That Christ's second coming will be cataclysmic, and that his kingdom will essentially commence at that point. Whereas radical postmillennialism espouses a social revolution as a cataclysm. So, in that sense, both Marx, Hitler were postmillennialists. They believed that there was a social cataclysm of their own making that would usher in this peace and prosperity for 1,000 years, but that it was going to be 1,000 years. So we hear about the reign of the Third Reich. It was going to be a 1,000-year reign, right? Marx held essentially the same views. And so both these are the church would have to reject both those kinds of things. The Bible opposes the notion of redemptive cataclysm occurring prior to the Last Judgment because the definitive cataclysm has already taken place. And that cataclysm was the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. So, in that sense, Christianity has always been amillennial, in that we're not looking at 1,000 years. We talked about it in the postmillennial view when we were discussing that a week ago, that we see that as more spiritual, or more figurative. The amillennialist takes it all spiritually. The postmillennialist takes it figuratively. We don't take it literally. And so the church really doesn't believe in this 1,000-year period. We see that it's always been postmillennial, it's always been amillennial. So it's really kind of both. What we believe is that Christ is king, and that's what's supported by the Bible. Chilton says this: the church has been generally optimistic in her view of the power of the gospel to convert the nations. Never supposed that their high calling, that is, the church's high calling, was to work for some sort of détente with the enemy. No pluralism, we're not going to make peace with our enemy. We are going to advance. Christ is on his throne. Christ is in charge. It's the church's job to make things better, to engage the culture, and to recapture what was lost by Adam. Adam, in his rebellion, brought sin and death into this world, and his charge had been his instructions had been to be fruitful and multiply and take dominion of the earth, which he couldn't do without being eaten. He ate prematurely from the tree and plunged us into what has been turmoil. So we've never been supposed to make peace with the enemy. We've always been supposed to take dominion, recapture, restore what's been lost. We're not just in the church, but we're supposed to recapture that in all areas of life, in school, in politics, in arts, all of it. It's all supposed to be recaptured. And that's what the Bible gives us instructions to do. And it's what we see gradually over time has been happening over time. And as the Bible was gradually revealed and more instruction and teaching has been given, that's what we're supposed to do. Those are the marching orders. That's why we see things getting better, because That's what the Bible teaches, and that's the way the Bible was revealed. We got more and more as we've gone. A couple more here. The church has always recognized that God sent His only begotten Son in order to redeem the world, and that He'll be satisfied with nothing less than what He paid. He was supposed to redeem the world. For God so loved the whole world. It's not, remember, the creation groans under the curse. The creation groans, not just people. The whole world. He so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son. And He came to redeem it. And that's what we're going to do as a church. We're going to advance His kingdom, and God, through the Holy Spirit, brings more and more recruits in, week after week, day after day. He's recruiting an army that will be working towards redeeming the world. The attitude of hope, the expectation of victory is an absolutely fundamental characteristic of Christianity. And the advance of the church through the ages is inexplicable apart from it. We expect that God will do what He said in His Bible, that He will redeem the world. He's used Christ, has made the way. Christ has infused the church with the Holy Spirit. And the advance of the church from 2,000 years ago to today, even in its pitiful state in the United States and Western culture, but the advance of the church is inexplicable without this understanding of how God's working in history. It's not our doing, it's His doing. He will be successful in His efforts here. So, that's as far as I'm prepared. We're out of time. As we get into this a little bit more next week, what I hope to do is get a little bit more into Revelation 20, and then working out some of the difficulties. I think there are plenty of difficulties in amillennialism and both premillennial systems. I don't want to talk about those so much. I really want to talk about the problems that we have within a postmillennial framework and how we view those things. So we'll deal with Revelation 20 a little bit more, and then we'll get into the postmillennial problems, so to speak. Are there any last questions or comments or even complaints? Okay, let's close with the word. Father, again, we thank You for the time that You give us, the breath that we borrow. You are indeed too good to us. We thank You again for the service today and the children. Pray that You would raise up many more. Pray too that we will always be mindful of Your purposes in history and Your purposes for us in that scheme. And we'll thank You for understanding that You grant us in Christ's name.